The gunshot that echoed through the dusty streets of Silver Creek made Grace Sullivan flinch. Even though she'd been hearing such sounds since arriving in this frontier town 3 days ago. The year was 1876, and the West was still wild, perhaps too wild for a Boston schoolteacher who'd come seeking a new beginning after her father's passing left her with nothing but debts and a tarnished family name. Grace smoothed her hands over her simple blue dress, clutching her small valise tighter as she made her way down the main street. Silver Creek, Colorado territory, looked exactly as she had imagined a western town would. A single dirt road lined with wooden buildings, their facades tall and imposing against the backdrop of distant mountains. Saloons with swinging doors stood alongside a general store, a small bank, and what appeared to be a sheriff's office. Men in dust-covered clothes watched her pass by, some tipping their hats, others staring with undisguised interest at the newcomer. Grace kept her chin high, refusing to show the fear that threatened to overtake her composure. She was here for a purpose: to take over the town's schoolhouse and provide education to the children of Silver Creek. The advertisement had promised modest accommodations and a small stipend, enough to rebuild her life away from the whispers and scorn of Boston society. Another gunshot rang out, followed by raucous laughter from the largest saloon, the Silver Dollar. Grace quickened her pace, nearly colliding with a man who stepped out from between two buildings. "Pardon me, madam," he said, his voice deep and rumbling like distant thunder. Grace looked up into the most striking face she'd ever seen. The man before her wore a dark hat pulled low over his forehead, shadowing eyes that seemed to reflect the blue of a summer sky. His jawline was strong, covered with several days' worth of stubble, and a small scar cut across his left cheek. He wasn't handsome in the refined way of Boston gentlemen, but there was something magnetic about his weathered features. "No harm done," Grace replied, finding her voice. "I'm afraid I wasn't watching where I was going. You must be the new schoolteacher." His gaze was direct but not unkind. "Word travels fast in Silver Creek. Yes, I arrived on the stagecoach Tuesday. Grace Sullivan." She offered her name but not her hand, maintaining the propriety ingrained in her since childhood. "Rhett Prescott." He touched the brim of his hat. "Town marshal." Grace felt a flutter of relief. The marshal would be a good person to know in a town like this. "Pleased to meet you, Marshal Prescott. Just Rhett will do." His eyes moved past her to something down the street, and his expression hardened. "If you'll excuse me, Miss Sullivan, duty calls." Before she could respond, he was striding away, his hand resting on the pistol at his hip. Grace watched him go, noting the way others seemed to step aside as he passed, a mixture of respect and wariness in their eyes. The next morning found Grace standing in the doorway of Silver Creek Schoolhouse, surveying the single room with its wooden desks and pot-bellied stove. A blackboard hung on one wall, and shelves holding a small collection of books lined another. It was simple but sufficient. Through the windows, she could see the vast expanse of Colorado territory stretching toward the horizon, mountains rising in the distance like guardians of the plains. She had spent the night in the small quarters attached to the schoolhouse, a bedroom barely large enough for a bed, a washstand, and a trunk for her belongings. The accommodations were Spartan compared to her family's former home in Boston, but she reminded herself that beggars couldn't be choosers. Her father's gambling debts had seen to that. Grace was arranging books when a knock at the open door drew her attention. A woman stood there, perhaps a few years older than Grace's, 23 years, dressed in a practical brown dress with her blonde hair pulled back in a simple bun. "Miss Sullivan, I'm Martha Townsend, the mayor's wife. I thought I'd come by and see if you need any help settling in." "That's very kind of you, Mrs. Townsend," Grace smiled, grateful for the friendly face. "I think I have things well in hand, but I'd appreciate your company if you have time." Martha stepped inside, glancing around with approval. "You've already made improvements. The last teacher, well, he didn't last long. left after 3 months, said the children were unmanageable. "I'm sure we'll get along just fine," Grace said with more confidence than she felt. "Back in Boston, I taught children from all walks of life." "Boston, you say?" Martha raised her eyebrows. "What brings a city girl like you all the way out to Silver Creek?" Grace turned away, arranging pencils on her desk. "A change of scenery," she said simply, unwilling to share the scandal that had driven her west. Martha seemed to sense her reluctance. "Well, we're glad to have you. The children need education, especially out here where life can be unpredictable." As if to emphasize her point, shouting erupted from the street outside. Both women moved to the window. 2 men faced each other in the middle of the road, hands hovering near their holsters. A small crowd had gathered to watch. "Not again," Martha muttered. "That's Dan Wilson and Pete Jenkins. They've been at odds since Pete won Dan's horse in a card game last month." Grace watched with growing alarm as the men continued to exchange heated words. "Shouldn't someone stop them?" "Rhett will handle it," Martha said confidently. "He always does." As if summoned by her words, Marshal Prescott appeared, striding purposefully between the 2 men. Grace couldn't hear what he said, but his stance was commanding, one hand resting casually on his holster while he spoke. After a tense moment, the men backed down, walking in opposite directions. "See," Martha smiled. "Rhett keeps order. He's been marshal here for 3 years now, and Silver Creek's a better place for it." Grace watched as Rhett's gaze swept the dispersing crowd, pausing briefly when he spotted her at the schoolhouse window. He touched his hat in acknowledgement, and Grace felt a curious warmth spread through her chest. "The children will arrive Monday morning," Martha was saying. 22 in total, ranging from 6 to 16. Most haven't had proper schooling, so you'll have your work cut out for you." "I look forward to the challenge," Grace replied, finally turning away from the window. Martha's expression grew serious. "One word of advice, Miss Sullivan. Silver Creek may seem rough, but it's home to good people trying to build something here. Judge us by our hearts, not our manners." "I'll remember that," Grace promised. After Martha left, Grace continued preparing the schoolroom, but her thoughts kept drifting to the marshal with the sky-blue eyes. There was something about him that intrigued her, a sense of contained strength, of carefully controlled power. It was foolish, she knew, to be thinking of any man after what had happened in Boston. Alexander Blackwell's betrayal had taught her a harsh lesson about trusting men with charming smiles and persuasive words. As dusk fell, Grace locked up the schoolhouse and walked to the general store to purchase supplies for her small kitchen. The store owner, a barrel-chested man named Henry, was helpful in pointing out what she might need. "Teacher's salary ain't much," he commented as he tallied her purchases. "But you let me know if you need credit. Education's important, especially out here." "Thank you, Mr. Henry. That's very kind." As she gathered her parcels, the store's door opened and Rhett Prescott entered, removing his hat as he stepped inside. Grace felt suddenly self-conscious of her simple dress and hair that had come loose from its pins during the day's work. "Evening, Miss Sullivan." His voice carried the same deep timbre she remembered. "Getting settled in all right?" "Yes, thank you, Marshal." She nodded politely. "The schoolhouse is quite satisfactory." "Glad to hear it." He moved closer, taking some of her packages without asking. "These look heavy. Let me walk you back." Before she could protest, he was holding the door open for her. Outside, the setting sun painted the mountains in hues of gold and purple, and the air had cooled considerably. "I don't want to take you from your duties," Grace said, as they walked side by side down the street. "Keeping citizens safe is my duty," he replied with a slight smile. "Besides, it's on my patrol route." They walked in companionable silence for a moment before Rhett spoke again. "Martha tells me you're from Boston." "Yes," Grace kept her gaze straight ahead. "I taught at a girls' school there. Long way from home. Sometimes a fresh start is necessary." Rhett nodded, understanding in his eyes. "Most folks come west for that very reason. Silver Creek's full of people running from something or toward something." "And which are you, Marshal Prescott?" The The question slipped out before Grace could stop herself. He considered for a moment. Both, I suppose, like most of us. He glanced at her. You'll find Silver Creek grows on you, Miss Sullivan. It's not Boston, but it has its charms. I'm beginning to see that, she admitted. As they reached the schoolhouse, Rhett handed her packages back. Their fingers brushed briefly, and Grace felt a jolt of awareness race up her arm. She stepped back quickly, fumbling with her key. Thank you for your assistance, Marshal. Rhett, he corrected gently. And it was my pleasure, Miss Sullivan. Grace, she offered, surprising herself. He smiled then, a genuine smile that transformed his weathered face and made her heart skip a beat. Grace, it suits you. With a tip of his hat, he turned and walked back toward town, his tall figure silhouetted against the darkening sky. Grace watched him go, feeling unsettled by her reaction to this man she barely knew. In Boston, she had learned the hard way that attraction could lead to disaster. The weekend passed quickly as Grace prepared for her first day of teaching. Sunday morning found her sitting in Silver Creek's small church, a simple wooden structure filled with familiar faces from her brief time in town. Martha Townsend waved her over to sit with her family, introducing Grace to her husband, the mayor, and their 2 children who would be in her class. Rhett Prescott sat near the back, looking somewhat uncomfortable in clean clothes that seemed more formal than his usual attire. Their eyes met briefly before Grace turned her attention to the service. Afterward, on the church steps, Martha insisted Grace join them for Sunday dinner. It's tradition to welcome newcomers properly, she explained, brooking no argument. The Townsend home was one of the largest in Silver Creek, a 2-story affair with actual glass windows and a picket fence. Inside, Grace found herself seated at a table with the Townsends and several other townspeople, including Dr. James Miller and his wife, the general store owner Henry and his daughter Clara, and to her surprise, Marshal Prescott. The conversation flowed easily around her as the group discussed local matters, the drought affecting local farms, plans for expanding the town, and rumors of a railroad potentially coming through within the next year or 2. A railroad would change everything, Mayor Townsend declared. Bring more settlers, more business, more trouble too, Rhett added quietly. Seen it happen in other towns. Progress always comes with challenges, Dr. Miller offered, but isolation has its costs as well. Grace found herself drawn into the conversation when Martha asked about education in the East. Is it true that, in city schools, children are separated by age and ability? In many cases, yes, Grace confirmed. Though I've found working with children of different ages can be beneficial for all involved. The older ones learn responsibility by helping the younger, and the younger ones are motivated to keep up. That's how it'll have to be here, Henry said. We can't afford more than 1 teacher. I'm quite comfortable with the arrangement, Grace assured them. In fact, I'm looking forward to tomorrow. After dinner, as the guests were preparing to leave, Rhett approached Grace. May I walk you back to the schoolhouse? Grace hesitated, aware of Martha's interested gaze. Thank you, but it's still daylight. I'll be fine. Humor me, he said quietly. It's a marshal's prerogative to be overcautious. Outside, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the town. They walked slowly, neither seemingly in a hurry to end the stroll. Nervous about tomorrow. Rhett asked. A little, Grace admitted. First impressions matter. The children here are good kids, mostly. Some are a bit wild, but they mean well. He gave her a sidelong glance. Like their parents. Grace smiled at that. Mrs. Townsend warned me not to judge by manners but by hearts. Wise woman Martha, Rhett nodded. She came out here as a bride 6 years ago, straight from Philadelphia, thought she'd made a terrible mistake at first. And now she'd fight anyone who suggested leaving, he chuckled. The West changes people, Grace, sometimes for the better. They reached the schoolhouse too quickly for Grace's liking. At the door, she turned to thank him and found him standing closer than she expected, his expression thoughtful. If you need anything at all, my office is just down from the bank, he said. "Doors always open to you." "Thank you, Rhett." His name felt intimate on her lips. He hesitated, then stepped back. "Good luck tomorrow. Those kids don't know how fortunate they are." With that, he was gone, leaving Grace to wonder at the flutter in her chest that seemed to appear whenever Marshal Rhett Prescott was near. Monday morning arrived with clear skies and a cool breeze. Grace stood at the schoolhouse door, ringing the small bell to signal the start of the school day. Children came from all directions, some walking from town, others riding in on horseback or in wagons with their siblings. They eyed her with curiosity and varying degrees of wariness. The day passed in a whirlwind of introductions, assessments, and establishing rules. As Martha had warned, the educational backgrounds varied widely. Some of the older children could barely read, while a few of the younger ones showed surprising aptitude. By the end of the day, Grace had a better understanding of the task ahead and a pounding headache. She was erasing the blackboard when a knock at the door revealed Rhett, hat in hand. "Thought I'd check how your first day went." Grace blew a stray strand of hair from her face. "Challenging but promising. Billy Jenkins has a remarkable mind for mathematics, though his spelling is atrocious. The Cooper twins need separate desks if anything is to be accomplished, and little Sarah Miller is terrified of reciting in front of others." Rhett leaned against the doorframe, amusement playing across his features. "Sounds like you've got them figured out already." "Hardly," Grace laughed. "But it's a start." She put down the eraser and rubbed her temples. "Though I confess, 22 children of varying ages and abilities is quite the challenge. You'll manage," he said with confidence. "You strike me as a woman who overcomes challenges." Their eyes met, and Grace felt that now familiar warmth spreading through her. Rhett seemed about to say something more when a commotion outside drew his attention. "Duty calls," he said with a rueful smile. "Good evening, Miss Sullivan." "Good evening, Marshal." As weeks passed, Grace settled into life in Silver Creek. The children made progress. The townspeople accepted her as one of their own, and she found herself enjoying the simpler rhythms of frontier life. She attended social gatherings, joined the ladies' quilting circle despite her limited sewing skills, and even rode out to some of the outlying farms to speak with parents who couldn't make it to town regularly. And through it all, Rhett Prescott remained a constant, steady presence. He made a habit of checking on the schoolhouse during his rounds, sometimes bringing her interesting books he thought she might enjoy, or simply stopping to exchange a few words. Grace found herself looking forward to these brief encounters more than she cared to admit. One evening in late October, as Grace was working late grading arithmetic exercises, a knock at the schoolhouse door startled her. Twilight had fallen, and she hadn't expected visitors. "Who is it?" she called, a touch of wariness in her voice. "Rhett," came the response. "May I come in?" Grace opened the door to find him standing there, looking more formal than usual in a clean shirt and vest. "Is something wrong?" "No, nothing like that." He seemed uncharacteristically hesitant. "I was wondering if you might like to join me for supper at the hotel restaurant. They've got a new cook from New Orleans who's supposedly quite talented." Grace blinked in surprise. Was this a social call, or something more? "Aye, that sounds lovely, but I'm afraid I'm not dressed for dining out." She gestured at her simple work dress, now spotted with chalk dust. "You look fine to me," he said quietly. "But if you'd prefer, I could come back in half an hour." Grace found herself nodding. "Yes, that would be perfect, thank you." 30 minutes later, having changed into her best dress, a deep green that brought out the gold flecks in her hazel eyes and pinned her auburn hair into a more becoming style, Grace waited nervously. When Rhett knocked, she took a deep breath before opening the door. The look in his eyes as he took in her appearance sent a rush of pleasure through her. "You look beautiful," he said simply. "Thank you." She accepted the arm he offered, trying to ignore the whispers and glances as they walked down the main street together. Silver Creek thrived on gossip, and the marshal escorting the schoolteacher to dinner would certainly provide fodder. The hotel restaurant was the finest establishment in town, with actual tablecloths and oil lamps casting a warm glow over the room. A piano player in the corner provided soft background music. Several diners nodded respectfully as Rhett led Grace to a table near the window. "This is lovely," Grace said, looking around. "I haven't dined out since leaving Boston." "I thought you might appreciate a change from your own cooking," Rhett replied with a smile. "Teaching 22 children must leave little energy for elaborate meal preparation." "You're not wrong," Grace laughed, "though I've improved considerably since my first attempts at frontier cooking." The evening passed pleasantly as they shared a meal of surprisingly sophisticated fare. Rhett proved to be an attentive listener and a thoughtful conversationalist. He told her about growing up on a ranch in Texas, his time as a scout for the Army, and eventually finding his way to law enforcement. "And what about you?" he asked as they lingered over coffee. "You've shared very little about your life before Silver Creek." Grace tensed slightly. "There's not much to tell. I taught at a private girls' school in Boston. After my father passed away last year, I decided a change was in order." Rhett studied her face. "That's the short version, I suspect." "It's the version I prefer to share," Grace replied. Meeting his gaze steadily, he nodded slowly. "Fair enough. We all have chapters we'd rather keep closed." The understanding in his voice touched her. Most men would have pressed for details or been offended by her reticence. Rhett simply accepted it as her right. As they walked back to the schoolhouse under a canopy of stars, Grace felt a sense of contentment she hadn't experienced in a long time. Rhett's presence beside her felt right somehow, as if they'd known each other far longer than a few months. At her door, he removed his hat, holding it against his chest. "Thank you for joining me tonight, Grace." "I enjoyed it very much," she replied honestly. Rhett stepped closer, his expression serious. "I'd like to call on you properly if you're amenable. Sunday afternoons, perhaps, or evenings when you're not occupied with school matters." Grace felt her heart quicken. "I'd like that," she said softly. For a moment she thought he might kiss her, and part of her wished he would. Instead, he took her hand and pressed his lips gently to her knuckles. "Good night, Grace Sullivan." "Good night, Rhett." She watched him walk away, her hand still tingling from his touch. As she prepared for bed that night, Grace wondered if she was being foolish, allowing herself to develop feelings for the marshal. Her experience with Alexander Blackwell should have taught her caution. Yet Rhett seemed different, honorable, straightforward, without pretense. Still, she reminded herself, appearances could be deceiving. And she had secrets of her own that could change how he saw her if they ever came to light. November brought colder weather and the first dusting of snow to Silver Creek. Grace added extra logs to the schoolhouse stove each morning, and the children arrived bundled in coats and scarves, their cheeks rosy from the cold. School continued to progress well, with even the most reluctant students showing improvement. True to his word, Rhett began calling on Grace regularly. Sunday afternoons often found them taking walks along the creek that gave the town its name, or sharing quiet conversation over coffee in her small quarters. Sometimes he would read aloud from one of her books while she graded papers, his deep voice bringing the words to life. The townspeople watched their developing relationship with interest and, for the most part, approval. Martha Townsend was particularly pleased, confiding to Grace that she'd never seen the marshal so content. Early December brought preparations for the town's Christmas celebrations. The schoolchildren were busy rehearsing a nativity play and learning carols to perform at the community gathering on Christmas Eve. Grace threw herself into these preparations, finding joy in the children's excitement. One afternoon, as snow fell gently outside, Grace was helping little Sarah Miller practice her lines when the schoolhouse door burst open. Billy Jenkins stood there, breathing hard, his face pale. "Miss Sullivan, come quick. There's been shooting at the bank." Grace's heart lurched. "Billy, stay here with the others. Don't leave the schoolhouse until I return." She grabbed her shawl and hurried toward the center of town, where a crowd had gathered outside the bank. People were speaking in hushed, urgent tones, and several men had rifles in hand. Grace pushed her way through, fear gripping her throat. "What's happened?" she asked the nearest person, Mrs. Cooper from the dressmaker's shop. "Bank robbery," the woman replied grimly. 3 men rode in, demanded money. Mr. Peterson tried to stop them and got shot in the arm. Marshal Prescott went after them. "Alone?" Grace's voice rose in alarm. "He deputized Sam Walters and John Miller to go with him," Mayor Townsend said, appearing beside her. "Don't worry, Miss Sullivan. Rhett knows what he's doing." But Grace couldn't help worrying. The 3 men waited in tense silence for hours, watching the road leading out of town. When darkness fell, lamps were lit and placed in windows, creating beacons for the men's return. It was nearly midnight when the sound of horses approaching brought everyone back to the street. 3 riders appeared through the gently falling snow, leading a 4th horse with a body draped over it. Grace's hand flew to her mouth until she recognized Rhett's tall figure in the lead. He dismounted stiffly, his face grim but unharmed. "Behind him, Doctor." Miller was already examining the wounded man. They'd brought back one of the bank robbers, apparently. "The other 2, someone called out. "Won't be troubling anyone again," Rhett replied tersely. His gaze swept the crowd until it found Grace, and some of the tension seemed to leave his shoulders when their eyes met. Later, after the wounded robber had been secured in the town's small jail and the stolen money returned to the bank, Grace waited in her quarters. A soft knock at the door announced Rhett's arrival. When she opened it, he stood there looking exhausted, a small cut above his right eyebrow the only visible injury. "May I come in?" he asked quietly. Grace stepped aside, proper decorum forgotten in her relief at seeing him safe. Once inside, Rhett seemed to sag as if the weight of the day was finally catching up to him. "Sit," she ordered gently, guiding him to a chair. "Let me look at that cut." "It's nothing," he protested, but allowed her to dampen a cloth and dab at the dried blood. "You could have been killed today," Grace said, unable to keep the tremor from her voice. Rhett caught her wrist, stilling her movements. "It's my job, Grace." "I know," she met his gaze. "That doesn't make it any easier to bear." Something shifted in his expression then, a softening around his eyes. "You were worried about me." "Of course I was worried," she admitted. "I care about you, Rhett." He stood slowly, his hands coming up to frame her face. "I care about you too, Grace Sullivan, more than I should, perhaps." And then he was kissing her, his lips gentle at first, then more insistent as she responded. Grace felt herself melting into him, her arms winding around his neck as the kiss deepened. It was nothing like the calculated embraces she'd experienced before. This was raw, honest emotion, and it left her breathless. When they finally parted, Rhett rested his forehead against hers. "I've wanted to do that for a long time," he confessed. "I'm glad you finally did," she whispered. He smiled, the weariness in his face giving way to something warmer. "I should go. It's late and people will talk." "Let them," Grace said boldly, then blushed at her own forwardness. Rhett laughed softly, pressing another quick kiss to her lips. "There's that Boston spirit. But for your reputation's sake, I'll be a gentleman and take my leave." He moved toward the door. "Rest well, Grace." "You too," she replied, knowing she would struggle to sleep with her heart still racing from his kiss. The following weeks passed in a blur of deepening feelings and stolen moments. Rhett was careful to maintain propriety in public, but when they were alone, he showed Grace a tenderness that made her previous romantic notions seem pale and insubstantial. They spoke of books, dreams, and hopes for the future, sharing pieces of themselves with each passing day. As Christmas approached, Grace found herself happier than she'd been in years. The school's nativity play was a success, with even the most reluctant performers rising to the occasion. Afterward, the entire town gathered in the church for carols and a community supper. Rhett found Grace as the celebration was winding down. "Walk with me," he asked, offering his arm. Outside, the night was clear and cold, stars blazing in the black sky. Fresh snow crunched beneath their boots as they strolled toward the creek, now partially frozen. "I have something for you," Rhett said, reaching into his coat pocket. He withdrew a small package wrapped in brown paper and tied with string. "Merry Christmas, Grace." Grace carefully unwrapped it to find a small leather-bound book of poetry, Tennyson, her favorite. "Oh, Rhett, it's beautiful." She opened the cover to find an inscription. "To Grace, who brought light back into my life. Yours, Rhett." "I wish I had something to give you in return," she said, touched by the thoughtfulness of his gift. "You've given me plenty," he assured her, drawing her closer. "More than you know." They stood together in the moonlight, the sounds of celebration fading behind them. Rhett's arms encircled her waist, and Grace rested her head against his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart. "Grace," he said softly, "there's something I need to tell you." The seriousness in his tone made her look up. "What is it?" Rhett took a deep breath. "I've been offered a position as deputy federal marshal. It would mean traveling, enforcing federal law across the territory." Grace felt her heart sink. "You're leaving Silver Creek." "Not necessarily." He held her gaze. "I haven't given my answer yet. It would mean more responsibility, better pay, but also more danger." "I see." Grace stepped back slightly, trying to process what this might mean for them for whatever was growing between them. "I wanted to discuss it with you first," Rhett continued. "Because what you think matters to me, Grace. You matter to me." The sincerity in his voice warmed her despite the cold night air. "What do you want, Rhett?" "I want to do work that makes a difference," he said honestly, "but I also want—" He paused, seeming to gather his courage. "I want a future with you if you'll have me." Grace's breath caught. "Are you proposing, Marshal Prescott?" A smile tugged at his lips. "Not formally, not yet, but I'm asking if that's something you might consider someday. Because if it is, I need to know before I make any decisions about this job." Grace thought of her past in Boston, the secrets she still kept. If they were to have a future together, she would need to be honest with him. The prospect terrified her, but Rhett deserved the truth. "There are things about me you don't know," she said quietly. "Things that might change how you feel." Rhett's expression remained steady. "Then tell me, Grace, whatever it is, we'll face it together." Taking a deep breath, Grace began the story she'd kept hidden since arriving in Silver Creek. "My father was a respected professor at Harvard. Until it was discovered, he had falsified research and embezzled university funds to cover gambling debts. The scandal ruined our family name. After his death, I discovered he'd mortgaged our home and left nothing but debts." Rhett listened without interruption, his eyes never leaving her face. "I became engaged to Alexander Blackwell, the son of my father's colleague. He claimed the scandal didn't matter to him." Grace's voice hardened. "But I later discovered he only wanted to marry me because he believed my father had hidden assets overseas. When he learned there was nothing, he ended our engagement publicly, humiliating me further." "I'm sorry," Rhett said quietly. "He sounds like a fool." "There's more," Grace continued. "Before leaving Boston, I confronted Alexander. We argued, and in my anger, I pushed him. He fell and struck his head on a marble fireplace. For a terrible moment, I thought I'd killed him." Rhett's expression remained unchanged. "Did you?" "No," Grace shook her head. "He was unconscious but breathing when I left. I later read in the newspaper that he'd recovered, but by then I was already on my way west. I fled, Rhett, like a criminal." "You were protecting yourself," Rhett said firmly. "Any court would see it as self-defense." "Perhaps. But the scandal would have been unbearable. My father's name was already ruined. I couldn't bear to drag it down further." She looked at him anxiously. "Now you know why I came to Silver Creek. I'm a coward who ran from her problems." Rhett's hands came up to frame her face. "I see a brave woman who faced impossible circumstances and found the strength to start over. Nothing you've told me changes how I feel about you, Grace. If anything, I admire you more." Tears filled her eyes. "How can you say that?" "Because I know what it's like to carry a past you're not proud of," he said gently. "We've all made choices we regret. What matters is who we choose to be now and who we choose to become." Grace leaned into his touch, overwhelmed by his acceptance. "And who do you choose to be, Rhett Prescott?" "A man worthy of your love," he answered simply. "If you'll give me the chance." In response, Grace rose on her tiptoes and kissed him, pouring all her relief and gratitude and growing love into the gesture. When they finally parted, both breathless, she whispered, "I'm giving you that chance. Whatever you decide about the marshal position, we'll find a way forward together." Rhett's smile was brilliant in the moonlight. "Together," he agreed. "That's all I need to know." New Year's Eve brought another community celebration, this time in the town hall, decorated with evergreen boughs and candles. A band played lively tunes, and couples young and old took to the floor for dancing. Grace, wearing her best dress and a ribbon Martha had insisted on lending her, found herself at the center of attention as Rhett led her through a waltz. "Everyone's watching us," she murmured. "Let them," Rhett replied, echoing her words from weeks before. "They're just jealous that I'm dancing with the prettiest woman in Colorado territory." Grace laughed, feeling light and happy. "Flatterer." "Honest man," he corrected with a grin. As midnight approached, Mayor Townsend called for everyone's attention, raising a glass in toast. "To Silver Creek and all who call it home. May the coming year bring prosperity, health, and happiness to us all." Glasses were raised, and as the clock struck 12, cheers erupted. Couples embraced, and without hesitation, Rhett pulled Grace into his arms for a kiss that drew whistles and good-natured teasing from the crowd. "Happy New Year, Grace," he whispered against her ear. "Happy New Year, Rhett." Later, as they walked back to the schoolhouse through the crisp night air, Rhett seemed contemplative. "I sent my response to the federal marshal's office today," he said. Grace's heart skipped. "And I declined the position." He glanced at her. "I told them I couldn't accept a job that would take me away from Silver Creek, and from you." Grace stopped walking, turning to face him. "Rhett, I never wanted you to give up an opportunity because of me." "I'm not giving up anything," he assured her. "I've been thinking about it for weeks, and I realized something important. This town, these people, they're home now, and you." He took her hands in his. "You're where my heart is, Grace Sullivan." Grace felt tears prick her eyes. "And you are where mine is, Rhett Prescott." He reached into his pocket, withdrawing something small that glinted in the moonlight. "I had planned to wait to do this properly, but I don't want to enter another year without asking." He knelt in the snow before her, holding up a simple gold ring. "Grace Sullivan, will you marry me?" Grace gasped, her free hand flying to her mouth. "Rhett, I know it's fast," he continued earnestly, "and I'm not a wealthy man. Being a town marshal doesn't pay much, but I've saved enough for a small house on the edge of town." "It needs work, but with time, yes," Grace interrupted, her voice thick with emotion. "Yes, I'll marry you." Rhett's face broke into a smile of such joy that it took her breath away. He slipped the ring onto her finger, a perfect fit, and rose to his feet, lifting her in his arms and spinning her around as she laughed through her tears. "I love you, Grace," he said when he set her down. "I think I've loved you since that first day you nearly ran me over on the street." "I love you too," she replied, the words feeling right and true. "Though I maintain you stepped into my path deliberately." "Best decision I ever made," he said, claiming her lips in another kiss. Word of their engagement spread through Silver Creek like wildfire. The following Sunday, they made it official by announcing it in church, receiving congratulations and well wishes from the entire congregation. Martha Townsend immediately appointed herself wedding planner, insisting that the town would host the celebration as a token of appreciation for both the marshal and the schoolteacher, who had become integral parts of their community. The wedding was set for early April, after the worst of winter had passed, but before the spring rains made travel difficult for those coming from outlying farms. In the meantime, Rhett worked on the small house he'd purchased, making repairs and improvements whenever his duties allowed. Grace often joined him in the evenings, helping to paint walls or simply bringing supper so they could sit together and envision their future home. One such evening in late February, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Rhett broached a subject they hadn't discussed. "Have you thought about what will happen with the school after we're married?" Grace had, in fact, been pondering this very question. "I'd like to continue teaching, at least for a while. The children need consistency, and I've grown quite attached to them." Rhett nodded thoughtfully. "I expected you'd say that, and I think you should. You're a gifted teacher, Grace." "You wouldn't mind having a working wife?" Grace asked, studying his reaction. "Mind?" Rhett smiled. "I'd be proud. Besides, our house is close enough to the schoolhouse that you could walk home for lunch if you wanted." The casual way he referred to it as our house filled Grace with warmth. "You're not like most men, Rhett Prescott." "Is that good or bad?" he asked with a raised eyebrow. "Very, very good," she assured him, leaning over to kiss his cheek. As their wedding day approached, Grace found herself increasingly reflective. One evening, while writing letters to the few friends from Boston she still corresponded with, she came across an old newspaper clipping that had been tucked into her writing desk, an announcement of Alexander Blackwell's engagement to a New York heiress. Rhett found her staring at it when he arrived to escort her to dinner at the Townsends. "What's that?" he asked, noticing her pensive expression. Grace handed him the clipping. "Alexander is getting married. I found this months ago but forgot about it." Rhett scanned the article, then looked at her carefully. "How do you feel about that?" "Relieved," Grace replied honestly. "And grateful." "Grateful?" Rhett set the clipping aside. "Yes." She moved into his embrace. "If not for Alexander's betrayal, I might never have come west. I would never have found Silver Creek or the children or you." She looked up into his eyes. "I wouldn't trade what we have for anything, Rhett, not for all the society connections or comforts of Boston." His arms tightened around her. "Neither would I, Grace, neither would I." The day before their wedding, a spring snowstorm blew in unexpectedly, blanketing Silver Creek in white. Concerns arose about whether guests from the outlying areas would be able to attend, but by morning, the storm had passed, leaving behind a pristine landscape glittering in the sun. In Martha Townsend's upstairs bedroom, Grace stood before a mirror as Martha and several other women helped her prepare. Her wedding dress was simple but elegant cream-colored silk that Martha had ordered from Denver as a wedding gift, with lace at the collar and cuffs. "You look beautiful," Martha declared, adjusting the small wreath of early spring flowers that crowned Grace's upswept hair. "Rhett won't know what hit him." Grace smiled nervously. "I can hardly believe this is happening. A year ago, I never would have imagined." "Life has a way of surprising us," Martha said wisely. "Especially out here." The church was filled to capacity when Grace arrived. Mayor Townsend had insisted on giving her away in the absence of her father, and he offered his arm with a proud smile as they prepared to enter. "Ready, Miss Sullivan?" he asked. "For the last time using that name." Grace took a deep breath and nodded. "Ready." The small church organ began to play, and all eyes turned as Grace walked down the aisle. But she saw only Rhett, standing tall and handsome at the altar, his expression one of awe and love as he watched her approach. He wore a new black suit and had trimmed his beard for the occasion, but his eyes were the same clear blue and honest, reflecting everything she'd come to love about him. The ceremony was brief but meaningful. They exchanged vows and rings, promising to love and cherish each other for all their days. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Rhett's kiss was gentle, but held a promise of passion that brought a blush to Grace's cheeks and cheers from the assembled guests. The celebration afterward was held in the town hall, transformed by the women of Silver Creek into a festive space with flowers, ribbons, and tables laden with food. There was dancing and laughter, toasts and well wishes. Grace found herself surrounded by people who had become her family in the span of less than a year. As evening fell, Rhett took her hand. "Ready to go home, Mrs. Prescott?" The new name sent a thrill through her. "Yes," she whispered. "Take me home." They left amid a shower of rice and good-natured teasing, climbing into the wagon Rhett had decorated with ribbons for the occasion. The short ride to their house was quiet, both of them absorbing the reality that they were now husband and wife. Their home, though small, had been transformed by their joint efforts over the previous months. Fresh paint brightened the walls, new curtains hung at the windows, and furniture, some purchased, some gifted by townspeople, created a cozy, welcoming atmosphere. A fire had been lit in the hearth by thoughtful neighbors, casting a warm glow over the main room. Rhett lifted Grace into his arms to carry her over the threshold, setting her down gently inside. "Welcome home, Grace Prescott." She looked around, taking in the sight of their home, their life together, with a sense of wonder. "It's perfect, Rhett." He turned her to face him, his expression suddenly serious. "There's something I need to tell you, Grace." Her heart quickened. "What is it?" "I'm afraid." He paused, a smile tugging at his lips. "I'm afraid you're going to have to put up with me loving you for a very, very long time." Relief and joy washed through her. "I think I can manage that," she replied, reaching up to touch his face. "In fact, I'm counting on it." Later, as moonlight filtered through the curtains of their bedroom, Grace lay in Rhett's arms, her head resting on his chest. The intimacy they had shared had been tender and passionate, a culmination of the love that had grown between them. "What are you thinking?" Rhett asked softly, his fingers tracing patterns on her bare shoulder. Grace propped herself up to look at him. "I was thinking about the day we met, when you said most people come west either running from something or toward something. And you were running from your past," he remembered. "Yes," Grace nodded, "but I was also running toward something, though I didn't know it then." She leaned down to kiss him gently. "I was running toward you." Rhett pulled her closer, his eyes reflecting the depth of his feelings. "And I'll be forever grateful that you found me." In the quiet of their first night as husband and wife, Grace Sullivan Prescott felt the last of her old fears slipping away. The path that had led her from Boston to Silver Creek had been marked by loss and uncertainty, but it had brought her to this moment, to this man who loved her completely, to a community that had embraced her, to a life fuller and richer than she had ever imagined possible. As she drifted towards sleep in her husband's arms, Grace whispered, "You're too pure for me." Rhett's eyes opened, surprise evident in them. "What makes you say that?" "Your goodness, your honor," she explained softly. "Sometimes I wonder how someone like me, with all my mistakes and secrets, deserved someone like you." Rhett rolled them gently so that he was looking down at her, his expression intense. "There's nothing pure about me, Grace. I've made my share of mistakes, fought battles I'm not proud of, carried guilt for decisions I can't undo." His hand caressed her cheek. "But with you, I find redemption. With you, I'm a better man." "Rhett," she breathed, moved by his words. His lips curved into a smile that held a hint of wickedness. "Besides," he murmured, lowering his head to trail kisses along her neck, "I'll teach you desire, Mrs. Prescott, and there's nothing pure about what I want to do with you right now." Grace's laugh turned into a sigh as his lips found hers, and she surrendered to the passion they shared, knowing that in each other's arms they had found not just desire, but something far more precious, a love that accepted, healed, and transformed them both. Spring bloomed fully across Silver Creek, bringing with it new growth and possibilities. Grace continued teaching, returning home each afternoon to the house she shared with Rhett. They fell into comfortable routines. Breakfast together before each headed to their respective duties, evenings spent sharing the day's events or reading by the fire, weekends devoted to improving their home or riding out to explore the surrounding countryside. News traveled fast in small towns, and by early summer, there was a new topic of conversation whenever Grace entered a room. When would the marshal and his schoolteacher wife be starting a family? Grace fielded these inquiries with grace and humor, though privately, she and Rhett had begun discussing the possibility. "I'd like children," Rhett admitted one evening as they sat on their porch, watching fireflies dance in the gathering darkness. "But only when you're ready." Grace leaned against his shoulder. I'd like that too, though I'm a bit selfish about having you all to myself right now, he chuckled, pressing a kiss to her hair. We have time. But fate had other plans. By August, Grace's suspicions were confirmed by Dr. Miller they would welcome a child in early spring. When she told Rhett that evening, his reaction was everything she could have hoped for: joy, wonder, and a tenderness that brought tears to her eyes. A baby, he said in awe, his hand gently resting on her still, flat stomach. Our baby. Are you happy? Grace asked, though his expression left little doubt. Happier than I ever thought possible, he assured her, gathering her into his arms. I love you, Grace Prescott. You've given me everything I never knew I wanted. As her pregnancy progressed, Grace continued teaching, though she arranged for Martha's niece, a bright young woman of 19, to assist her in preparation for taking over when the baby arrived. The town rallied around them, offering congratulations, advice, and gifts for the coming child. Winter came and went, and with the first signs of spring, Grace's time drew near. On a clear April morning, almost exactly a year after their wedding, she gave birth to a daughter they named Elizabeth, Martha Prescott Elizabeth for Grace's mother, and Martha for the friend who had become like family. Rhett, who had paced anxiously outside during the delivery, was overcome with emotion when Dr. Miller finally allowed him to enter the bedroom. The sight of Grace holding their tiny daughter reduced the stalwart marshal to tears. She's perfect, he whispered, carefully taking the swaddled infant into his arms. Like her mother. Grace watched them together, her heart so full it seemed it might burst. I think she has your eyes. Poor child, Rhett joked, but his gaze never left his daughter's face. Hello, Elizabeth. I'm your father, and I promise to protect you always. The days that followed were a blur of joy, exhaustion, and adjustment. Rhett proved to be a devoted father, often walking the floor with Elizabeth when she was fussy at night so Grace could rest. The town celebrated the new arrival, and Silver Creek's first family settled into their expanded life together. One evening, as summer approached, Grace sat in the rocking chair on their porch, nursing Elizabeth as the setting sun painted the sky in shades of gold and pink. Rhett joined her, sitting on the porch step by her feet, his expression contemplative. What are you thinking about? Grace asked, noting his faraway look. How much has changed in 2 years, he replied. When you arrived in Silver Creek, I was a solitary man with little beyond my duty. Now. He gestured to their home, to her and Elizabeth. Now I have everything. Grace reached out her free hand to touch his cheek. As do I, more than I ever dreamed possible. Rhett caught her hand, pressing a kiss to her palm. Do you ever regret it? Coming west, leaving behind the comforts of Boston? Never, Grace said firmly. Not for a single moment. This is where I belong, where we belong. He smiled, the same smile that had first captured her heart. I was just making sure. As darkness fell around them, they remained on the porch, a family bound by love and the shared journey that had brought them together. Grace thought of all the twists and turns, the heartaches and joys that had led her to this moment, and found herself profoundly grateful for each one. In the distance, Silver Creek lay peaceful under the emerging stars, the town that had become home. And beside her sat the man who had taught her that love could heal old wounds, that the past need not define the future, and that sometimes the greatest adventures begin with a single step into the unknown. Elizabeth sighed contentedly in her arms, and Rhett's hand came to rest on Grace's shoulder, a gesture of quiet connection that spoke volumes. Together, they watched the first stars appear, secure in the knowledge that whatever challenges tomorrow might bring, they would face them as they had faced everything else together, with courage, honesty, and an abiding love that had transformed them both. And in that perfect moment, Grace knew with absolute certainty that the journey that had begun with, "You're too pure for me," had led her exactly where she was meant to be in the arms of the man who had taught her not just desire, but the profound, life-changing power of true love.